They thought he was untouchable, and for nearly a decade they were right. On July 5, 2014, inside a small international airport most Americans couldn't find on a map, a Russian hacker sat barefoot in flip-flops scrolling his phone 90 minutes away from boarding a flight that would make him legally invisible forever. Inside his laptop were 1.7 million stolen credit card numbers. Inside his pocket was a passport backed not by law but by blood. His father sat in the Russian parliament, and that connection had neutralized every arrest warrant, every extradition request, every attempt to stop him. For years, U.S. investigators watched him drain millions of dollars from American victims while hiding behind a border they were forbidden to cross. But that afternoon, something changed. Across the departure lounge, two sunburned Americans in cargo shorts pretended to browse souvenir magnets. They carried no guns, no badges, no legal authority in this country. What they did carry was a decision that would test the limits of international law itself. There was no extradition treaty, no court order, no legal way to arrest him on that soil. In less than a minute, they would either let the most prolific credit card thief on Earth disappear into Russian protection forever, or commit an act that could ignite a diplomatic crisis between nuclear powers. This was not a sting. It was not an arrest. It was a reverse heist. And once it started, there would be no way to undo what came next. He didn't need a gun, a getaway car, or a masked crew, because his crime didn't announce itself when it happened. It arrived later quietly in bank statements and declined cards in small American businesses that suddenly couldn't explain why thousands of dollars had vanished overnight. His weapon was code, and it worked best when no one noticed. For years, his malware slipped into point-of-sale systems across the United States, restaurants, hotel chains, retail counters where customers smiled, swiped, signed, and walked away, believing the transaction was complete. It was, and it wasn't. In the milliseconds between approval and receipt, the data duplicated itself. Card numbers, expiration dates, CVV codes all siphoned off without tripping alarms. Victims didn't feel the theft because nothing was taken from their hands. The damage surfaced weeks later when accounts were frozen, payroll bounced, and owners stared at balance sheets that no longer made sense. This wasn't chaos. It was engineering. He didn't just steal data. He standardized it, packaged it, and sold it at scale. His websites ran like legitimate marketplaces, clean interfaces, inventory counts, bulk pricing, turning stolen financial identities into commodities traded by fraudsters on 6 continents. What made it devastating wasn't the sophistication alone, but the distance. He never saw the waitress whose tips disappeared, the family-owned diner forced to close, the retiree who spent months fighting to prove a charge wasn't theirs. Those consequences were abstract to him. Numbers on a screen, while the profits were tangible supercars, chartered yachts, resort suites that cost more per night than most Americans earned in a month. By 2014, investigators could verify more than $170 million in losses, tied directly to his operation, and they knew the real figure was higher buried in disputes never resolved and victims who never connected the dots. This was theft without confrontation, violence without bruises, harm delivered through systems people trusted every day. And that invisibility was the point. The quieter the crime, the longer it ran. The longer it ran, the more confident he became. Because while Americans paid the price, one transaction at a time, he learned the most dangerous lesson of all. You don't need to be powerful to break the system, only protected, once you do. Everyone knew who he was, and that was the most infuriating part. U.S. investigators didn't hunt a ghost. They tracked a man with a name, a face, a digital trail so complete it could have filled courtrooms for years. They mapped his aliases, followed servers hopping from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, watched transaction logs light up in real time like a pulse monitor for a living system of fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, meticulous, and useless because every path forward ended at the same invisible wall jurisdiction. His father sat in Russia's parliament, and that connection did what firewalls and encryption never could. It made the law stop working. Extradition requests were filed, formatted, and sent across diplomatic channels, only to be returned with sterile language and polite excuses that fooled no one. Some never came back at all. In Moscow, protection didn't need to be written down to be understood. On Russian soil, he operated with a confidence that bordered on mockery, bragging in underground forums about how untouchable he was, daring American agencies to do something they legally could not. For the investigators, the years blurred together, new victims, new losses, the same outcome. They watched small businesses fold under fraud. They didn't cause watched families fight banks to prove innocence. Watched a criminal empire expand while their own case files grew thicker and heavier with no place to go. This wasn't a failure of intelligence or effort. It was a failure of the system itself. International law designed to prevent chaos had become a shield for it. And slowly a more dangerous realization set in. If the rules could be exploited this easily, then justice wasn't blind, it was fenced. The border didn't just protect nations, it protected men who learned how to hide behind it. By the time the hacker booked his ill-fated vacation, the investigators had already crossed a psychological line. They no longer asked whether he was guilty. They asked how long the world would tolerate a reality where everyone knew the truth and still nothing happened. After years of moving like a shadow, he made the mistake that only comfort allows. The discipline that had kept him safe, avoiding countries with extradition treaties limiting travel, living behind screens, began to feel unnecessary. He had beaten the system too many times to believe it could still surprise him. What he wanted now wasn't another payday, but validation, a reward worthy of the myth he'd built around himself. The Maldives offered exactly that: turquoise water, 5-star isolation, and most importantly, a legal vacuum. No extradition treaty with the United States. No courtroom where American warrants mattered. In his mind, it wasn't a risk. It was proof of mastery. He booked a private overwater villa complete with a personal butler and a deck stretching out over the Indian Ocean, spending more on a single vacation than many of his victims earned in a year. Paradise felt earned. Immunity felt permanent. What he never saw was how thin that sense of safety really was. Airline reservations are data, and data leaves traces. When his name passed through routine screening systems thousands of miles away, it triggered something no amount of political protection could fully suppress attention. In Washington, analysts who had watched him operate with impunity for nearly a decade suddenly realized the clock was ticking in reverse. This wasn't just another trip. It was a narrow window opening and closing at the same time. He thought he was stepping outside the reach of the law. In reality, he was stepping into the only moment where geography, timing, and arrogance aligned against him. While he imagined sunsets and still water, others were counting days, then hours, then minutes. The vacation, he believed, confirmed his invincibility, was quietly transforming into a deadline. And once that deadline existed, the story was no longer about whether he would make it home safely. It was about how far someone else might be willing to go to make sure he didn't. By the time the opportunity became clear, the law had already failed them. The conference calls were brief, tense, and unusually honest. Everyone on the line understood the stakes. If they followed procedure, they would lose him forever. Formal extradition meant notifications. Notifications meant Moscow. And Moscow meant a warning call, an early flight, and another decade of watching the damage accumulate from behind a legal wall they were forbidden to cross. This wasn't about evidence anymore. They had more than enough. It was about whether the rules written to prevent abuse of power could also be exploited to protect it. Someone finally said what no statute or policy ever allowed: if the system couldn't reach him, then the system would have to bend. The decision wasn't celebrated. It settled over the room like a weight. Careers were on the line. Diplomatic relationships could fracture. If exposed, the operation wouldn't be defended as clever, it would be condemned as kidnapping. And yet, doing nothing felt worse. Each day of delay meant more victims, more businesses hollowed out by fraud, more proof that power could hide indefinitely behind borders. The plan that emerged didn't look like justice, it looked like improvisation. No arrest warrants, no court appearances, just a narrow legal fiction fragile enough to collapse under scrutiny, but strong enough to work if executed perfectly. They would act as tourists. They would rely on immigration authority instead of criminal law. They would move fast and quietly before politics could catch up to reality. This was the moment the story crossed its moral threshold. The agents involved understood that whatever happened next would redefine their careers not as investigators, but as actors in something far more dangerous. They weren't asking whether he deserved prison. That question had been answered years ago. They were asking whether the cost of breaking the rules was lower than the cost of letting the rules be broken forever. Once that calculation was made, there was no room left for hesitation. The operation shifted from theory to motion, and the line between enforcement and abduction blurred into something history would argue over long after the plane either took off or never did. The plan unraveled the moment reality pushed back, because reality always does. On the morning of July 5th, the sky over Malay darkened faster than expected, monsoon winds tearing across the runway and grounding commercial flights one by one. For the agents watching weather radar from a cramped hotel room near the airport, the storm wasn't atmosphere, it was a clock. Every passing minute increased the chance that a phone call would reach the Russian embassy, that pressure would flow downhill, that the fragile agreement holding everything together would snap. They moved anyway. Inside the terminal, the hacker walked toward passport control with the calm confidence of a man who believed geography was on his side. His girlfriend at his arm, his future already mentally secured. When the immigration screen flashed red, confusion flickered across his face, then irritation, then something sharper as uniformed officers guided him into a small windowless room normally reserved for visa disputes. He still thought this was procedural solvable beneath him. That illusion lasted seconds. The door opened, and the Americans came in, fast hands on arms, voices flat decisive, offering no explanation that could be argued with. The struggle was sudden, and violent furniture scraping a chair slamming into the wall as panic replaced arrogance. In that chaos, instinct took over. He tried to save the one thing that mattered more than his own body, his laptop. The machine held his entire empire: servers, passwords, transactions, names. If it disappeared, the case would evaporate into suspicion. He thrust it toward the doorway, shouting to his girlfriend, but an agent intercepted it midair and passed it off with a single urgent instruction: keep it awake. If the screen went dark, encryption would seal everything forever. Outside, the storm intensified, rain hammering the tarmac as the SUV accelerated toward a private jet idling in sheets of water. Phones rang. Word reached Moscow. The quiet phase was over. At the executive terminal, blue lights reflected off wet concrete as the jet's engines spun up. Then came the order from the tower hold position: do not take off. Inside the cockpit, the pilot hesitated, knowing what defiance meant. In the cabin, the prisoner locked his feet against the floor, shouting that this was an act of war, that his father would make them pay. An agent leaned close and confirmed what everyone already knew. Yes, this was a kidnapping. The pilot pushed the throttles forward anyway. The jet surged down the runway, buffeted by wind lifting into black cloud, just as a final command crackled through the radio, ordering an immediate return. No one answered. As the ground fell away and the Maldives disappeared beneath the storm, there was no cheering, no relief, only the heavy understanding that a line had been crossed in full view of history, and whatever waited on the other side of that flight would decide whether this gamble became justice or a cautionary tale. Once the wheels touched American concrete, the story stopped being about escape and started becoming about proof. The moment the jet entered U.S. jurisdiction, power shifted, not with force, but with paperwork, custody, and time. Inside the cabin, agents opened the laptop they had fought to keep awake, half expecting resistance encryption, some last act of defiance. Instead, the screen lit up like a confession left unfinished. Active dashboards showed recent sales of stolen card data. Draft emails listed thousands of credit card numbers formatted for immediate delivery. Password files mapped aliases to servers across multiple continents. Years of investigation suddenly compressed into a single machine captured mid-keystroke. This wasn't circumstantial evidence. It was a living archive of a criminal empire frozen at the exact moment it was still operating. For the investigators, there was no triumph in the discovery, only a grim validation that the risk they'd taken might actually hold up under scrutiny. On the ground, the diplomatic fallout arrived on schedule. Moscow accused the United States of state-sponsored kidnapping, denouncing the operation as a violation of international law. The Maldives issued careful statements about immigration enforcement that convinced no one. Washington offered no apology, only a restrained insistence that a criminal had been brought to justice. But none of that noise entered the courtroom. There the case unfolded in silence and numbers. Transaction logs aligned with victim reports. Server records matched aliases beyond dispute. The laptop filled every gap defense attorneys might have exploited. Over the next 2 years, prosecutors built a case that didn't rely on politics or rhetoric, only on math data and timestamps. When the sentence came 27 years in federal prison, the longest ever imposed on a hacker in U.S. history, it landed without drama. No speeches, no victory laps. Just a man who had spent years believing himself protected by borders, learning that evidence travels farther than influence. The courtroom doors closed, and with them, the question of guilt. What remained unresolved was something larger. The conviction proved the crime. It justified the pursuit. But it could not erase the method that made the verdict possible, or the uncomfortable truth that justice in this case arrived only after the rules were set aside. In the end, this story isn't really about a hacker, a plane, or a storm over the Indian Ocean. It's about what happens when systems built to protect order begin protecting power instead. The man at the center of this case deserved prison on that. There is little debate. He caused real harm to real people quietly and at scale, and he believed geography and bloodline made him untouchable. But the way he was brought to justice exposes a harder truth that doesn't sit comfortably, especially for Americans who believe deeply in due process and the rule of law. This case shows that when legal systems fail, governments don't stop acting, they adapt. Sometimes creatively, sometimes dangerously. A tactic used to capture a criminal can, under different leadership or fear, be used to silence a journalist, intimidate a dissident, or erase someone who becomes inconvenient. The same flexibility that closes one loophole can open another far more troubling one. That's the real legacy here. Justice was served, but the method bypassed the very guardrails meant to keep power accountable. For a country that defines itself by laws rather than rulers, that tension matters. It should make us uncomfortable. It should force us to ask where the line is, who draws it, and what happens when no one is watching. Stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're warnings wrapped in adrenaline. If you value deep investigative storytelling, if you believe these conversations matter, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who cares about power and accountability, and subscribe for more stories that dig beneath headlines and challenge the narratives we're told to accept. Because understanding how the system breaks is often the first step toward figuring out how to fix it.